topics that I've been talking about regarding the left-hand path, and then more recently, the suppression or oppression of the sacred feminine. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So give me just a second to do these other things here. For some reason, when I use Restream, it won't restream directly to the New Day Global group, and it has it even on my Facebook page as private, so I have to change it to public and then share it in the group. And for some reason, I haven't been able to see comments from Facebook. I can see comments from YouTube, but I can't see comments from Facebook as easily. So I'm going to try to follow those on my phone. All right. So I have a disclaimer. My disclaimer is I am not responsible for anything I say. Wait. Okay. I need to be responsible for what I say. I'm not responsible for how you hear or perceive or what you do with what I say. How about that? So what I want to talk about today, actually I'm putting under the title of Paul's Dilemma. And the reason I say I'm not responsible is because I'm doing something I don't necessarily like to do, and that's I'm presenting information publicly that I haven't fully incubated or thought out. So this stuff is new for me. This is stuff that I'm thinking about, that I'm incubating, that keeps coming up for me in synchronicities. I've seen a couple of videos from people online or just content that people have been putting out. Renegade, if you haven't seen her stuff, it's just been amazing. I've watched a few of those videos, been tagged on a few of them, and it's just been right in line with stuff that I've been thinking about. So my attempt today is to crystallize some things that I'm thinking about, so I know ahead of time that I'm going to say some things that I may necessarily end up saying, oh, no, that wasn't correct, or I don't believe that, or I may get, again, some of the details and the information wrong. And I'm going to try, however, in doing this, to make sure that you're not drinking from a fire hose. So, having said that, let's get started. And the Broncos and the Bills are playing today. So I want to make sure I catch that. You can see I'm wearing my Broncos jersey today. If you're born and raised in Colorado, you either love or hate the Broncos. Most people love the Broncos. Some people hate them. So what is, when I say Paul's Dilemma, what specifically? So I can see Facebook comments today because I see Shannon Morris says, you've been doing this all along. I know that. My goal is to kind of tie some things together and make you think. And in a way, I think that can really transform our lives. Really, genuinely. I think I'm in the midst of another awakening, another transformation. Several people have on Facebook that I follow or that show up on my feed have been talking about this same kind of thing. Barbara Simons has been talking about it for quite some time as well. I guess writing about it. I didn't get to see the live videos that she's done. I haven't had a chance to sit down and watch those, but Barbara, if you're watching, I want to be able to do that. When I'm talking about Paul's dilemma, I'm talking about his Romans 7 dilemma that so many of us can relate to. So I'm going to read a pretty lengthy part here of Romans 7 to give you an idea. So I apologize to those of you that aren't in the Bible or into the Bible and all that stuff, but you'll see that what he's talking about here is a very human experience, especially for those of us that were in the church or try to follow any kind of spiritual path or be on any kind of mystical pathway. So a few things I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about Paul's dilemma, which I'll get into in a minute. The dark night of the soul. That's a term that gets used a lot. I'm going to talk about its origins, what it really means in its origins. Shadow work. I'm going to talk about what it really means in its origins. And then I'm going to try to bring it all together. So let's start with Paul's dilemma. So chapter 7, starting about verse 4, I may skip over some of this. But in verse 4, he says, "So, my brothers and sisters, you also died to the law through the body of Christ, that you might belong to another, to him who is raised from the dead. For when we were in the realm of the flesh," I'm reading from the NIV version here. "For when we were in the realm of the flesh, the sinful passions," notice that, the sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in us, so that we bore fruit for death. But now, by dying to once bound us, we have been released from the law, so that we may serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. What shall we say then? Is the law sinful? Certainly not. Or I like the King James Version, God forbid. Nevertheless, I would not have known what sin was. This is important. I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. For what I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had said, you shall not covet. But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of coveting. For apart from the law, sin was dead. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died. I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. For sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me, and through the commandment put me to death. So then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. Did that which is good then become death to me? By no means. Nevertheless, in order that sin might be recognized as sin, it used what is good to bring about my death, so that through the commandment sin might become utterly sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. I do not understand what I do. This is the dilemma. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I end up doing. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me. That is, in my sinful nature. For I have desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. Here's the dilemma. I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now, if I do not do what I want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me that does it. So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being, I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man that I am! Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself in my mind am a slave to God's law, but in my sinful nature, a slave to the law of sin. So I cannot tell you how many times when I was a believer, especially early on, I would read that passage and say, Paul, you get me. I can relate so much to this passage, and so many Christians as well, and wrestled with this and tried to untangle this. And what is Paul talking about here as far as being delivered and set free from this dilemma? The good that I want to do, I can't do. And the thing that I hate, that I keep doing. And this could apply. This doesn't have to apply to you just if you're religious. This can apply on multiple levels. For example, we are in the month of January. January 1st, a lot of people make what we call New Year's resolutions. I'm resolute this year, I'm going to do this, or this year I'm going to do that. By the way, 80 to 90% of the people, based on some surveys, when they make a New Year's resolution, it has to do with weight loss and health. Just saying. But there is something I came across, a term that I've seen in commercials. I've heard them talk about it on the radio that I never knew existed. And that is the second Friday of January is considered to be what they call Quitter's Day. Quitter's Day, because it is the second Friday in January when the vast majority of people will give up on their New Year's resolutions and quit them. Now, think about this. This is funny to me. We will, if we make a New Year's resolution, we're going into a new year. We have some sense that there's something about us that needs to change, or at the very least, something about us that we want to change. And so vast majority of people will say, I'm going to change this. And by the second Friday in January, barely 2 weeks out, they say, screw it, to hell with it. They give up and quit. If that's not an example of the thing I want to do, I don't do, I don't know what is. I mean, it's so much a part of our humanity, right? That they have a day for it. They call it Quitter's Day. The thing I want to do, that I don't do. And then ultimately, we all have some bad habits. We have some things. It might be laziness. It might be procrastination. It might be habitual use of some substance, alcohol or nicotine or marijuana or whatever the case may be. But a bad habit that we want to quit. So the thing I hate, so quitting that, starting the new good habit, the thing I want to do, I can't do. And the thing I hate, that I end up doing. Very common, ubiquitous, universal human problem, exacerbated by religion, and specifically, especially exacerbated by religion that finds its origin story in Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden and sin and et cetera and so on. So what Paul's describing here, the reason so many of us wrestled with this, the reason so many of us maybe got frustrated with this, is because it really explains well the human problem, right? The problem in the passage, so there's the problem, the human problem, the thing I want to do, I don't do, and the thing I hate, that I keep doing. But then the problem in the passage is that there are these value judgments. Now, value judgment is anything that we define as good or bad, things that we want, things that we don't want. So the pleasure and pain principle. I put judgments on pain because clearly I don't want pain, and I say pain is bad, and I put judgments on pleasure and say all these things for pleasure are good. Unless you're a Christian, of course, then you reverse that, totally reverse that, because everything that's pleasurable we can't do, and all this boring, laborious, tedious stuff like spending time in prayer and fasting and trying to work out things like our pride. And here Paul's talking about his covetousness, getting to the root of what's going on inside of us that's covetous, right? So it's the exact opposite. So we then kind of place a value judgment on the good is that which is painful and sucks, and at least it's boring or tedious. And that which is bad is all the pleasures and things that we enjoy in life. Now, let's just break this down just from the perspective of the human being. And this is where I'll get a little bit maybe into the neurology of the brain, right brain, left brain, hemisphere type stuff. All right. So, and I want to talk about the dark night of the soul as well. So I'm just trying to keep myself on track and remember what it is that I'm talking about. So a normal value judgment, back to value judgments. Normal value judgment is we place something as good or desirable and something as bad and undesirable. But religion and Paul and mysticism and spirituality in general takes this to a whole other level. And the way this happens in the passage is that Paul says the good, which is the law, the Torah, the good is not just good in the sense of a normal value judgment. It is God's law. It is authoritative. It is eternal. It is unchangeable. Even Jesus said in Matthew, the heaven and earth will pass away, but the law, heaven and earth will pass away before one jot or tittle of the law will be done away with. Don't think I came to do away with the law. I came to fulfill the law, all that kind of stuff. And so it takes on a higher moral quality because we're saying this is the way the Creator wants us. And then there's added the concept of punishment. So for Paul in the passage, the result of sin, or the punishment for sin, you could say, but if you don't want to say punishment because you're really in the weeds about the semantics, then the result of sin, the consequence of sin, is death. For evangelicals, the result or the consequence of sin is eternal conscious torment in hell, ultimately. But there can be other consequences as well. If we're not pleasing to the Lord, then we might not be blessed. If we're not in the will of God, life might not be working out for us. And if I have some sin in my life, some habitual pattern that's labeled by the law as something that I should, that's evil, that's wrong, that's awful, then this habitual pattern can destroy my self-esteem. It can destroy my sense of self-confidence. And Paul brings this out as well, because he concludes with this statement, "Oh, wretched man that I am," right? I'm this wretched, horrible human being. So we kind of have the origins of the idea of original sin in the writings of Paul. And I say that because really we say that Augustine of Hippo, one of the church fathers, that he gave to the Western world, he's considered the father of Western theology, and he gave to the Western world this concept or this idea of original sin, this idea that in our members nothing good dwells, that Paul's talking about here. In our members, in my body, who will deliver me from this body of sin? You'd see some hatred for the body there. Definitely the sin impulse, the sin nature that Paul's describing here. And Augustine takes his theology, father of modern theology, he takes his lead in theology from the writings of Paul the Apostle, I think probably because he could relate to Paul. Now, Augustine did not give us the idea of original sin. In other words, he didn't originate the idea of original sin. He codified the idea of original sin, and it became the foundation for a lot of Western, not just theology, but philosophy and psychology, even influencing people like Sigmund Freud, who's considered, I suppose, the father of modern psychology. This idea of original sin, this idea that there's something inside of us that's evil and wrong that we need to eradicate, that we need to get rid of. But especially we need to do that if this is what God views. If God views certain things as good and right and holy, and my urges and behaviors and habits are wired to go against that, then I conclude that I am sinful and I am evil. So Paul says, "Oh, wretched man that I am." It'd be interesting. I've been wondering if there's anybody that has done a psychological analysis or a personality analysis of two people that are key in Western Christianity, Augustine and many centuries later, Martin Luther, the father of really the Reformation. Both, if not all three, have something very distinct in their personalities. They have an incredible neuroses, complex, or disorder of self-loathing, self-rejection, and self-hatred. And you cannot separate their psychology from their theology. Here we see self-loathing in Paul, "Oh, wretched man that I am." In Augustine's Confessions, we find out that Augustine was very promiscuous. He had a very strong sexual drive. And so his attempt to overcome and override his sexual drives led him into a ton of self-loathing. Martin Luther, the reason that he propagated the idea of justification by faith is because he was afraid of the horrors of hell. I think in one place it was Martin Luther who said, "I found that I hated God's righteousness. I hated it." So he also had this self-loathing and this fear of condemnation and this fear of hell. So when he reads the Apostle Paul's words about justification by faith and realizes, oh, I can be saved apart from my works, really what people are saying there when they're saying I can be saved apart from my works, this has nothing to do with theology, really. This has nothing to do with revealed knowledge from heaven to humanity about the nature of things and how things should be. It really has to do with this struggle that's inside of us, that where the thing that we want to do, we don't do, and the thing that we hate, we end up doing. And so salvation apart from works says it gives us an out, if you will. It gives us a peace and a rest. It lets us take a deep breath. So I can imagine Martin Luther, when he reads that, taking a deep breath and saying, okay, even though I have these passions and I have these desires and I have these sinful habits and I have all this stuff that I know God hates and God rejects, and I hate the righteousness of God, I don't have to fulfill all of that. In other words, it's okay for me to have these things. It's kind of like a psychological coping, or a theological coping mechanism for a psychological problem. I'm going to say that again. Justification by faith, or salvation apart from works, is a theological coping mechanism for a very human psychological problem that when people obsess over it, it leads them into self-rejection and self-hatred. Let's see, Shannon says something here that's a good segue, I think, in the next part of this. She said, I think it is curiosity and fear. I want to investigate, but I'm afraid of the consequences. So I don't do what I want. I don't satisfy my curiosity. So I'm not exactly sure, Shannon, what you're talking about there. I don't want to make assumptions of the context or content of it just based on that. But I want to pick up on this idea of I'm concerned about the consequences, because this is what sets us apart from every other living creature on planet Earth. It's the ability to self-reflect. It's the ability to self-reflect and think about consequences of our instinctual drives. So let me do it this way. Let's say that we take strictly an evolutionary or biological approach to this problem rather than a theological one. That what Paul is dealing with is the animal instincts that we have, our natural animal instinct, because we are an animal that lives on this planet, or if you don't like the term animal, our natural biological instincts, our survival instincts, and the ability to self-reflect with logic and reason and other mental capacities that tell us, maybe I don't want to, maybe the consequences of that aren't so great. Maybe if everybody just ran wild with their instinctual drives, instead of seeing these things, whatever it is that Paul's struggling with there, instead of seeing it as sin in the members, seeing it as simply instinctual drives for survival. And then the ability to analyze those instinctual drives, reflect on those instinctual drives, think about the consequences of those instinctual drives and how they affect me and how they affect society. That is unique. Every other species out there pretty much is ordered by their intuition and their instinctual drive. This spark of reflection upon the self, this what the depth psychologists would call individuation, the idea that I am an individual, I have individual desires and individual temperament and all of these various different things, that is the result of the tree of knowledge. And Aaron, how can you say that? I can say that because in the story, prior to eating at the tree, there's no individuation in the story. I'm going back to the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. There's no individuation because they're both naked and they feel no shame. And the moment that they eat at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, their perception changes. The story tells us that their eyes were opened and they knew that they were naked. They became aware of their biology. They became aware of their sexuality. At the end of the day, they became aware of their sex. I'm male, she's female. They became aware of their sexuality. And then we see individuation when God shows up to Adam and says, "What have you done, Adam?" And Adam says, "It's the woman that you gave to be with me. Not just this one flesh, or she came from my rib, or she's my helper thing anymore. It's she was supposed to be my helper and she didn't help me." Individuation. Adam hid himself from God, individuated from God. God is, I am me, and God is the other. Individuation from the woman. It's the woman you gave to be with me. She caused me. Individuation from the serpent. It was the serpent's fault. So all this sort of blame shifting to take it off of the self. So we see self-reflection and individuation. This is the consciousness. And this is what God himself says, they've become like us. So when we talk about sometimes the Imago Dei, which is a Latin term for the image of God, or we talk about the divine spark, or we talk about divine consciousness, or we look at the myth of Prometheus giving the fire of the gods to humanity. It's this unique capacity that we have as human beings to self-reflect on consequences. Now, the Torah, the law, what is the law? The law in Romans, it's the law of God. This is how God instituted for humanity to live. But on its more basic level, the law is the consensus of the community about consequences, about right and wrong. So in other words, instead of having a species like the bees that I've been talking about, or like the wolves, instead of having a society, social relationships that are strictly rooted on us all following our instinctual drives, this ability to self-reflect, this ability to think about what's good and what's evil, this ability to think about order and structure as opposed to just instinct run wild. Then we're trying to relate to each other with all of that. So the community comes to a consensus and says, as a community, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. So in other words, it's not best for society or the most productive for society if theft goes unchecked, therefore thou shalt not steal. If murder goes unchecked, therefore thou shalt not kill. And covetousness, if we go around just coveting and wanting everything that someone else has, which we see very, very young in children, right? I had my boys are 15 months apart. And so when they were very little, you know, they could be playing with Legos and have 50 different Lego parts that are all essentially the same. And they're all laying on the floor, but the two boys are fighting over one Lego. And each one saying, no, that's mine. No, that's mine. Or one of the children being very involved with the toy that they're playing with until they see the toy that the brother has. And then they want to go get the toy that the brother has. Now imagine if that instinct and that drive was left completely unchecked and we all tried to live together in some kind of civilized society. So we had to come up with group consensus. So the Torah, the law, was the group consensus of the nation of Israel as it was forming. And of course, it was given to them by their God. But because of monotheism, because God is the God, the only God, then it becomes, this is the way that everyone has to live. And if you want to live contrary to that, which you want to do anyway, because the whole purpose of the law, the whole purpose of the consensus of the community is to allow us to bring those instincts into check so that we can relate well as a community to one another. Relating as human beings in community is impossible without laws, at least as far as we know, right? So if we reframe the problem, then we can say what we're really dealing with is instinctual drives and the knowledge of good and evil, the ability to self-reflect on these instinctual drives and how they affect us when we live together, I think we'd be okay if that's all the farther that we took it, but we take it to the level of, no, this is the eternal will and word of God, and I have to conform. Now we're into a right-hand path. I have to conform myself to this way of being. And it gets to the point with, especially in Western theology, with Paul, with Augustine, with Martin Luther, that if I have these desires, and we can blame Jesus and the teachings of Jesus for this, because Jesus is the one who says in Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, if you get angry at your brother without cause, you're in danger of hellfire. So that drive, that instinctual drive to anger, is just as sinful as murdering somebody. Or the instinctual drive for sex is the same as marital unfaithfulness and cheating. If you lust after a woman, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. If you get angry at your brother, you've essentially already murdered him. And so we look at something that's very part of being human, that's part of the human experience, that is literally hardwired into our biology. The very presence of these instincts themselves are defined both by Jesus and by Paul and by the entire Christian community as being sinful, as being ungodly, as being the impulse and the urge to do something that's contrary to God. And so then life becomes structured and ordered around, for those that are disciples of Christ, for those that are going to be followers of Jesus, for those who really take it seriously and want to live to that. Then it's not just like in a secular society where it's a natural curbing of instincts in order to avoid social consequences and to allow us to live together peacefully and in community. It becomes the presence of sin itself just as bad as the action. See, under the law of Moses, if you commit murder, you are, the problem is not that you got angry. The problem is that you took away the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of another person by unaliving them. The problem is not that you coveted. The problem is that you stole someone else's property. The problem is not that you have a high libido. The problem is that you violate the family and the social orders in order to fulfill that high libido. So the problem is in the actions. The Jewish writers and Jewish thinkers had it right. It's not the same. But what we've done in Christianity with the inclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, and the inclusion of Jesus' teachings, and the inclusion of Paul the Apostle, and then exacerbated by Augustine and Martin Luther, the problem that we have is we say these instinctual drives are not what it is to be human. It's not what it is to be experiencing life in these biological bodies. It's not what it is to be part of the material world and part of material existence. It is in and of itself just as bad as the actions. It is in and of itself sin, so therefore it has to be eradicated, and therefore God can't accept me. Oh my God, if you knew what I thought. Yeah, I may be doing this on the outside, various different things, but if you knew what I thought. And people say, well, Jesus was just condemning the Pharisees because they were condemning all these people for their actions while they themselves had the same instincts. Damn it, everybody has the same instincts. They weren't hypocrites because they had the instincts. Oh, they were just hypocrites. They were saying you shouldn't do it, but they wanted to do it anyway. And Jesus is telling them that the problem is you have to clean the inside of the dish. See, that's to presuppose that those instincts are wrong. That's to presuppose that the instincts are dirty. If I have to clean the inside of the dish, then I'm presupposing that my heart is sinful and wicked and deceitful above all things. I'm presupposing that there's impurities and there's sin and there's all that, so it has to be cleaned out. No, it's a normal, natural part of being a human being. It's part of this biological experience. Now, from a different perspective, from a different perspective of spirituality, we can say that life goes on, that life consciousness, let's say it this way, that consciousness, if consciousness, not even spirituality, if you take an idealism approach, and I'm talking about philosophy here, philosophical idealistic approach to life instead of a scientific materialist approach to life. The difference is the materialist says physical matter, therefore physics and physical laws are primary to reality and to nature. Idealism says consciousness, awareness is primary. If materialism is primary, then consciousness is the byproduct of materialism. So it stands to reason and logical conclusion that when these bodies die, that's it, that's the end. If consciousness is primary and material is secondary, in other words, conscious existence, awareness is primary and the body secondary, then when we shed these bodies, our consciousness still exists. So this is the problem as it's formulated within spirituality. I am a spirit being having a human experience. I'm an eternal consciousness, part of the divine, part of the universal mind of God, however you want to understand that. And I'm having a biological human experience. And as part of this biological human experience, what I agreed to was the human experience. And in this human experience that is biological are these biological drives and impulses. We can call them emotions. And learning how to not, if you begin from the place that to try to eradicate my instinctual impulses is to say no to being a human being. It's a form of spiritual bypassing of the human material existence. And this is the problem as I see it. You don't have to agree with me, but as I see it, the problem with most religions today, certainly the problem with Abrahamic religions, but we see this in other religions as well, and we certainly see this in other spiritual paths. I'm saying no to this biological experience. I'm saying no to being a human being. Therefore, these urges, these drives, these instinctual impulses, I want to get rid of. And anything that takes on the expression of these impulses, the expression of these instincts, even if it's socially appropriate, even if these instincts and drives manifest themselves in ways that are not harmful or doing the least amount of harm, at least, to other people, right? We consider them lower vibrations. We consider them spiritual stepchildren, if you will. Those areas of us become orphaned, if you will. Rather than, but in reality, we're saying no to that. So I think that's the primary reason for the dark night of the soul. What is the dark night of the soul? People say, I went through a dark night of the soul. When really what they're saying is they're using the term dark night of the soul as a term for, I went through a major bout of depression. The term dark night of the soul, as far as I can tell, originated with the writings of an ancient mystic, I think it's okay to call him ancient, called John of the Cross. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila. Now, if you've never read Dark Night of the Soul written by John of the Cross, or you've never read things like The Interior Castle written by Teresa of Avila, I might invite you to do that. Because they're talking about the dark night of the soul in a very different way. And it's really depressing writing. It's agonizing, to be honest. It's like, but the basis of it is this. And this is the basis of a lot of, getting rid of your ego attachments and things of this nature. It's all hostility towards nature. Because the dark night of the soul for John of the Cross and the mystics was a loss in the material world of things that we desired or things that we attached to in order to serve a purpose towards cleansing and purifying the soul so that the soul can cling to the divine. Is a necessary process in the path of return. It's a necessary process for the soul, the individual, to become merged or united into the Godhead. And this was seen as the goal of the mystic, to unite with God, or to unite with that which has no material existence or representation. So, of course, if I'm going to emerge back into the greater self, or I'm not emerge, I'm going to submerge back into the greater self, or submerge back into the divine, submerge back into Christ, find union with Christ, find union with God, because God and Christ exist as not something that is measurable, not something that is tangible, not something that is observable. Then my consciousness has to dissolve all bonds and attachments to that which is material, to that which is physical, to that which is part of nature and part of this life. So therefore, a dark night of the soul is a necessary process for what we call spiritual growth, or for the mystical goal of union with God, or nirvana, or whatever the case may be. It's all the same thing. It's all rejection of nature. So technically, it's okay to say, hey, I went through a dark night of the soul, and you're just talking about really clinical depression. But the etymology, the origins of the term, when you use it that way, is divorced from the mystical process, because the mystical process says I need to be absorbed back into divinity. Make sense? There's something else that they talk about, the night of spirit. The night of spirit's even worse than the night of the soul. The night of spirit is where you lose all desire for everything, even spiritual things, even what they call spiritual consolations, which would be things like spiritual ecstasy, the good feelings that I get when I pray, the sense of God's presence or the nearness of God's presence. And so to get to this place of union, you had to lose. So you can think about the dark night of the soul as detachment from what's outside of us material, but not the night of the spirit is detachment from even desire. And so we go through dry spells, and we go through difficult periods. And that was, again, to prepare the soul for union with God, for experiential union with God. If we do away with that entire paradigm and say we are here to embrace nature, we are here to embrace our bodies, and in embracing our bodies, we are here also to embrace our biological instincts, although for them to be sublimated. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And I got to hurry because I got to see the Bronco game. Very carnal of me, very unspiritual of me. So I got about 15 minutes. So I said I'd talk about the right and left hemispheres. And it didn't go that direction. But let me go ahead and do it anyway, because I did put it in the description. Because what I want you to understand is that these instinctual drives are located, not just instinctual drives. Okay, let me back up. Shadow work. We talk about shadow work today. We are not talking about shadow work the way Carl Jung talked about shadow work, or the early depth psychologists talked about shadow work. And it was Carl Jung who first proposed the metaphor of the shadow and shadow work as something that needed to be done in the psyche. Now it has evolved into something else. Shadow work in the psychological community and shadow work in the therapeutic community is a dinosaur. I mean, it is virtually extinct, but it has been taken up. The idea of shadow work and the term shadow work has been taken up in the spiritual community, so that it's generally holistic practitioners and people that are on a spiritual path who talk primarily about shadow work. And what we tend to say is that the shadow is that part of us that contains the hidden aspects of our nature. Those things that we know about ourselves that we don't want other people to know. Things like our trauma, things like our secrets, things like those unacceptable parts of us that we'd be embarrassed if anybody knew about it. And we say that's all part of the shadow. And certainly that's an appropriate use of the term. I'm just trying to say it's an evolved use of the term, because Carl Jung, when he was talking about the shadow, was talking specifically about aspects of the personality that were outside the consciousness of the individual personality. In other words, if you have trauma and you know that you had trauma, if you know that you experienced abuse as a child and that it's affected you in negative ways, it's not shadow. If you have aspects of your instincts that you've had to corral, it's not, and you know about it, it's not shadow. Shadow for these guys was what we cannot see about ourselves. So I'm not sure, and this is just where I'm at, where I'm thinking right now, I'm not sure that the term shadow work is always helpful, because we tend to still demonize things like trauma and things like these instinctual drives. I hope that makes some sense to you. Now, so we would say then that when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about instinctual drives, we're talking about all of these things. Actually, Sigmund Freud would say that there are two primary principles to what he called the id, the instinctual drives. The instinct to create, or in this case, to procreate, and the instinct to destroy. So he talked about things like a death wish. Or we all know, if we know anything about Freud, we know we got into all kinds of strange sexual ideas. Like one of the primary things that he talked about was what he called the Oedipus complex, or sexual attraction for a male boy towards the maternal figure, towards mom. Talked a little bit about the Electra complex, which would be the other way around. But you have to understand, these guys were products of the Victorian age. And there's a whole weird thing about the Victorian age that I'll get into later. All right. Let's talk about the right hemisphere, because I want you to understand the instinctual nature of this. And for better or for worse, I'm going to try and unpack this in 10 minutes. For better or for worse, when we talk about masculine and feminine energy from a spiritual perspective, from a hermetic perspective, from a perspective of polarities, the feminine energy and the feminine nature has always been linked to nature and nature religions. We see this today in some aspects of shamanism, certainly in neo-paganism, Wicca, things like that. If you think about it, it makes sense, because the body that we are given is built by mom. I mean, it just starts with the sex act. Mom, women know this, right? One of the imbalances between men and women, a human with a womb, you have to eat, you have to take today prenatal vitamins, you're hungry because you're eating for two now. So the body is being built inside the woman. The fetus is part of the woman's body. The seed goes in, the sperm goes in, and the fetus becomes part of the woman's body. So because this body is material, so it's the woman who is providing the material aspect of the human experience. So therefore, the woman, or the feminine energy, becomes intuitively and logically connected to everything that is matter. Material, the word mater, mother, maternal. It all comes from the same root. So material, maternal, matter, mother, it's all talking about feminine energy. Now, another thing that's common in spirituality is to identify the hemispheres of the brain, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, with masculine and feminine energy. The problem is that's not biologically accurate. I have no problem if you talk about the right hemisphere as being the hemisphere of emotion, the hemisphere of creativity, the hemisphere of imagination, images. And you talk about the left hemisphere as being the hemisphere of logic and rationalism and linear thinking and all that stuff. I have no problem if you identify the feminine aspect with emotionalism and imagination and creativity, and you identify the masculine energy or the masculine principle as logical, rational, reasonable, linear. But please understand that the map is not the territory. And when you talk about those things in that way, you are using metaphors and not speaking accurately about the nature of either masculine energy or feminine energy. I'll give you an example of this, because here's the idea. We have this idea that somehow men and women have different brains, and scientists have yet to find any difference between a male brain and a female brain. What we do identify is we say women have characteristics in that they're more emotional, in that they're a little bit more instinctual, mother's intuition we talk about. And we say that men are more logical, they're more rational, they're cut off from their emotions. And we act like this is some reality of biology or whatever the case may be. Nothing could be further from the truth. The truth of the matter, anybody can look this up, the truth of the matter is that emotions are not located in the right hemisphere of the brain. These differences between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere is pop fiction. We know this. Now, it's antiquated, it's outdated, because your emotions are part of your nervous system, part of your body. Your instincts are part of your nervous system. They are part of your body. And all of that activity is located in the deeper part of the brain where there are not two hemispheres. That's called the limbic system. And then on top of the limbic system, there is what we call the neocortex, or the new brain. This is what gives us the rational thought, the image of God, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. All of this takes place in the neocortex, which is composed of the right and left hemisphere. So we have it, there are divisions in the brain, but we have it wrong. Emotion and instinctualism and creativity is not coming from the right hemisphere. It's coming from the limbic system. Those impulses, you could say impulses and emotions are coming from the limbic system, and they're being logically evaluated so that logic and rationale and all those other components are a cooperative effort of the neocortex, or a cooperative effort between the left and the right hemispheres. Now, we all have those. But because, watch this, our instinctual drives going all the way back to ancient Egypt, this is the case, and probably even further. Because those natural instincts that come from the limbic system, that come from the nervous system, that come from the human biological experience, because they were recognized, whether intuitively or somehow objectively, very early by humanity as being the product of being an animal, be a product of being part of this world, it became identified with the feminine energy and the feminine nature, because it's buried deep, it's hardwired into who we are. And the neocortex gives us the ability to reflect, self-reflect, and think about how are we integrating as humanity. So really what Paul's talking about in Romans chapter 7, he's trying to get rid of his neocortex. He's trying to get rid of his humanity. So I want you to think about this way then. All of the messaging that we get, even you need to break your attachments with worldly things. You need the end of suffering is to not desire for things in this human experience. Because the feminine energy comes from matter and materialism. It's all tied to the oppression and suppression of the sacred and divine feminine. Do you realize the word hysteria? If we say someone's being hysterical, and hysteria up until, I don't know, fairly recently, going all the way again back to ancient Egypt, was considered a medical problem that was uniquely feminine. So this idea that women are just out of control, because see, the neocortex, the self-reflective part, looks at nature and says, nature's out of control. Nature's completely instinctual. Nature is harmful. Nature is chaotic. Nature is catastrophic. And it's feminine. So out of control emotionalism, feminine. To emotions, feminine. Intuition. What is intuition? Did you know there's a word called extuition? The word tuition, when you go to a college, what do? How do you go to college? You have to pay tuition. It has to do with learning and knowledge and information. So intuition is that which is instinctual and comes from within. Extuition is that knowledge which comes from without. So we say we identify with the feminine energy. The feminine energy is intuitive. The feminine energy is more instinctual. The feminine energy is also wild and out of control. Hysteria, the word hysteria and hysterical comes from the word uterus in the Greek. Hystera, uterus. Hysteria, belonging to the uterus. The Egyptians believed that it was a malfunction of the uterus that caused mental and emotional hysteria. So because these principles get identified with feminine energy, then we say women are a certain way and men are a certain way. Nothing could be farther from the truth, the actual biological truth and reality of things. Women can be just as, if not more, logical than men. They can be just as alienated and divorced from their emotions and their instinctual drives. In fact, maybe even more so because of the centuries of oppression upon the creative impulse or the sexual impulse upon women, because of the suppression of the destructive impulse upon women. I mean, think about what we've done to women in society. And I'm going to have to go here. I'll pick this up later in a later video for the New Day Global Group. But think about what we've done to women. It was a common belief in Victorian age that women didn't have sexual desire. And that's what caused hysteria. Look it up. It's funny. The treatments, I mean, if you want to know where sex toys originated, they were medical devices to cure women of hysteria, because they didn't, and especially women that didn't marry, especially women that didn't have children, because they must not have any sexual desire because they're women, right? It's an attempt to suppress the creative principle, which is recognized as feminine and gets projected psychologically, not in the reality of things, but psychologically onto the woman. I know some men that are very emotional. I know some men that are very hysterical. But watch this. We've also suppressed the urge for destruction, which is also part of feminine energy. Don't believe me? Don't we have a saying out there that hell hath no fury like that of a woman scorned? So women become involuntarily in society the projected object. This is where the real shadow comes in. The projected object, the projection of a neocortex that needs to suppress the limbic system. And in spirituality and in religion, an existence that wants to bypass being human. They're all intimately connected. This is why I think what would do us good would be a really strong return to nature religions. I think it would do us some good. Some of us need to repent to Mother. We repented to Father when we got saved and in the church, but some of us need to repent to Mother for our sins against Mother, for our sins against biology, for our sins against nature, for all this foolishness that we have. You have to break attachments and lose the ego and suppress these urges and desires, as though the urges and desires themselves are evil and wicked and sinful. Because, let me come back to this, for women, we say for men, it's not okay. Somebody just told me Denver's up 7. Marietta, thank you. And I'm going to have to go because I was recording the game. But also women are repressed in anger. We say boys don't cry. Heaven forbid, if you're a woman, you show some anger. If you show some anger, you're a bitch. If you show some anger, it must be that time of the month. Maybe you're menstruating. Maybe it's your cycle. It's all connected to spiritual bypassing. So when I say a return to nature religions, what I'm talking about is a restoration of the sacred feminine. I believe that's where the answer lies. I believe the answer to a lot of these psychological maladies and wholeness as a human being, authenticity, commitment to authenticity, authentic spirituality. I guess that's what I'm really pressing for. And that's why I've been on this soapbox, if you will, for weeks and months now. And that's why I love and believe in the left-hand path, because there needs to be a place for the proper channeling of these instinctual patterns and these instinctual drives. They need to be seen as sacred and holy and good. Sublimated in some cases, yes, so that we can relate well with each other and in society. Demonized and seen to be evil, never. And somehow, if we were able to conceive of a spirituality that fully embraced materialism and fully embraced humanity, fully embraced that feminine energy, or a spirituality that restores the sacred feminine, that would be a very left-hand path in my mind, way of thinking. All right, I think I got everything out. I got to go check out the game. Thank you for watching this. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, as we say on Theology Friday. I'm going to follow up because again, this was all groundwork. I'm going to follow up in the New Day Global group later this week, a video just for people that belong to the Facebook New Day Global group. Some of you who are radically conservative or passionate about free speech and you left Facebook and you're watching on YouTube, the good news is go watch Mark Zuckerberg's or Mark Zucker. Is it Zucker? Mark Zucker, the guy that created Facebook, the CEO, whatever. Go watch his interview with Joe Rogan on the Joe Rogan Experience, and you can come back to us on Facebook, and you can join the New Day Global Facebook page, because I'm really just laying a foundation for this. I want to get more in depth, and really, I didn't even get to the good stuff yet. So I'm going to share the good stuff in the group. You got to belong to the group. It's a private group. People can't even share the videos because it's a private group. So please be sure to find that in my bio. And